and we're being recorded, so we'll finish the recording in about an hour's time, and we will do questions and answers after that. But we will also take some questions through the presentation. So no further ado, over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Barry. Thanks for the invitation. It really helps me because after 78 and after I did the articles for the Aero Modeler, I should have done more publications. Every 10 years, I think there was enough material to do some, but I was either too lazy or I had no time. But I thank you for this opportunity. So now I went back in time a little bit and try to understand why we did what we did. Maybe I will publish later because, well, I gained interest again in it. This story, this background story is not really a success story. It's about a lot of experiments that didn't work out, but they helped us to get better afterwards. I must say that we were pretty successful making the pylon racing engines in the early 90s, late 90s, and I think all the experience we gained from the team race engine has helped a lot to get them going. And it's a little bit like Henry Nelson. He was a team race diesel builder, and as soon as he started to do pylon racing engine, he was extremely successful in making them. So for some reason, there seems to be a connection between the two. Yeah, I go to my, where are we? I go to my text. It was after 78 that my brother and I, Bert, discussed, and we said from now on we will just try things and see where we get. We still wanted to win, but only when we could do something new with it. So that's when we started to develop. So we started try to understand. So we made a calculation model of gas flow. Bert started it, and I went on with it on, well, pretty primitive computers, calculation of gas flow, heat flow, pressures, forces. We had the opportunity to have students to have F2C models in wind tunnel, and we had one of our guys, Eric Janssen, to do wind tunnel work on electrically heated cylinder heads. So I will talk tonight about that and what our conclusions and well, what we did with it actually. The start after the engine of 78, which was a steel engine with hard chrome cylinder, kind of special piston. Well, I will not say too much about it because it's all been published in this Aero Modeler article. After the World Championship, I remember I sat in a train somewhere 2 months after, and I thought we have to go to aluminium. And there was a good reason to do that, because not many people know, but about 1 hour after that we won the World Championships final in Woodvale, it was Mauke Schwentner who was second in that final. They tested or they practiced a new Nelson engine, which was an AAC. And I am about 100% sure if they would have used that engine in the final, they would have won it, because that engine was much better than the steel one they were using in that final. So I was convinced we had to go to AIC. People that have read the FMV article in Aero Modeler see that we were thinking already about material combinations that you could use for aluminium cylinders and pistons so that it could work. And funny enough, that these ideas seem to be quite right. So in that train, I made the drawing of the cylinder you see on the screen here, which is we call integral cylinder. It's one piece between aluminium and fins. It still has a separate head. Of course, later, I think about around 2000, it was Semelander who made even the head integral one piece. I wanted to do that, but I could not make it. And you need a lot of accuracy to get that right, because you cannot change the distance between your head and your exhaust port anymore. And it's kind of complication. But the FMV was already prepared to have it. You see the lugs beside the four lugs beside the exhaust and round that could have 4 short balls to have such a cylinder. At the moment I made the drawing of this cylinder, I thought I had done an invention, something new. But my good friend Enrico Flores, who is of course always was part of the team, he still was at that time. He was also he was working at the patent office in The Hague, and he was looking into patents. And this is a patent of Sachs, the moped engine maker, of 1952. They made already a design like this for a moped engine. So it's nothing new, but at that time it was kind of new. When we made this engine, and we had it first time in '79, we immediately saw its potential. We could simply make easily more power than any steel engine at the time. Funny enough, there was a guy, I think it was Ingo Schmidt in Germany, who tried the same at about, well, maybe one year later in speed, and never got anything going. I heard Russians get this type of cylinder on speed, wouldn't go. Still hard to understand why this is. I slowly start to understand, but not so easy. Has to do with heat sink capacity, things like that. I don't know. So the cylinder was kind of new for that time. You see the piston on the right side. Because I did already then calculation on expansion, because aluminium expands more than steel. So there are reasons to worry about that, because we have no piston ring that compensates for all the size differences. So we made still the piston with the central hanging of the conrod, so that the skirt of the piston was not supported was supported symmetrically everywhere. So it could move, well, more or less like a piston ring. It could move in and out. It's quite thin. And well, I thought it was absolutely necessary for an AAC engine of this type, with maybe a very cold cylinder, because it's cooling very well. There's not a drop-in liner, which is not really connected to the crankcase, so you never know what happens there. You know exactly what happens here. But we were kind of scared that the cylinder would not have the right size. Well, it didn't seem to be a problem, but this was the way we made the solution. Another thing we were worried about in those days was if we would gain power, that the conrod would get too high temperature and would give all kind of problems. So you see that the conrod it has a lot of cooling. So that was the way we went with this engine. We were very lucky to find at that time a Mahler material for the cylinder and also for the piston. We used Mahler 138 for the first pistons, Mahler 244 for the second. That's a 24% silicon alloy, which was of very bad quality, actually. I mean, the casting of it was not so good. But the lucky shot was the cylinder. Not because of the material, it's a kind of ordinary 12% silicon alloy, but it's made in a way that you can get chrome on it. And we were just lucky. My brother, he was the chemist of the team, and he did the chroming of oil. It took him a few months before he got any chrome on anything on this kind of material, but he found a way to get chrome on the aluminium. And after a few years, when we tried other alloys, it appeared that the Mahler was by far the best chroming alloy. So we got it right because we were lucky to have the Mahler. Maybe the trick of the Mahler 124 material is the fact that you can chrome it. I don't really know. Okay, I go on with the next one. I will try. I'm not going to explain you the full model, but I just want to show you how simple it actually is. And you see the small drawing here. That's my engine. It starts on the left side with the intake, the air intake. Then you have a crankcase. And of course, this is not a pipe, but it's a pipe that closes and opens all the time. So there, of course, there's a parameter that does something there. Then there's the crankcase, which has a volume, and well, all the other almost unreadable for you maybe properties: the volume of the case, the area of the metal, the temperature of the wall, the pressure of the gas, and so on and so on. So that's the crankcase. The next step, of course, in the two-stroke is the transfer ports, the transfer ports to the cylinder. That's, of course, also an opening that closes and opens all the time. And then you have the cylinder where something extra happens. You get heat generation there. When the piston is somewhere going up, you get heat generation. And of course, then you have the exhaust. So this is the calculation model with all the parameters you see below, and which I will not go through because that would be boring. Maybe if I do a publication, I will try to make a kind of explanation of that. I mean, it's a very simple model, and these are just volumes. So the whole volume has one temperature and one pressure and one density. So that's already a simplification, of course, of the real thing. The good thing, it could run on I think we started this in 79, this model. It could run on a table calculator, HP 9815, 2000 programming steps. And later on my Apple, somewhere in the early 80s, I bought an Apple II, and it would run for 3 to 6 hours to do one variation of the engine. Well, when you do calculation, you have a very big number of things you can variate, like all kind of timings, intake timings, I mean the Venturi, then the transfer timing, the exhaust timing, compression ratio. You can choose your moment of ignition, the duration of your ignition. Well, you can do a variation of crankcase volume and things like an extra heat producer. That's the friction in the crankcase. This is the kind of thing we had from the early FMV days when we had not a very well cooled big end. We had blue pins all the time. It's described in the FMV article that it was, I think it was, who was it? Your English guy. Well, I cannot think of his name. He had changed the intake system of the Nelson to a Natalenko system, which not directly cools the big end pin, and he had a blue pin in his Nelson, which no one had ever seen. So then we understood that we had a wrong induction system. We need to put fresh gas and fuel on the crank pin. That's very important. So what does such a model do? It simply changes by 1 or 2 degrees the position of the piston in the system. So you get all kinds of volume changes, and you get all kinds of volume changes, the gas flow. In itself, these are quite complicated thing, because all gas flow is kind of supercritical, or how you call it. It's kind of shockwave transport of gas. It's not simply, it's not Bernoulli's law. It's different from that. It's kind of adiabatic expansion all the time, because the ratios of pressures are so high. So that these are the parameters we've been which are important. And what you get with such a model is you just start it. You put in the initial pressures and temperatures and everything, and you let it run. And you let it run a couple of revolutions, and hopefully it stabilizes. So it's stable when the end of the cycle is, all the parameters are the same. I mean, the pressures and temperature are the same as the beginning of the cycle. So after a number of revolutions, you get a kind of steady state situation. I took as a criterion that it would be steady state if the air intake, the air mass that goes through the venturi is equal to the air mass going through the transfer ports, is equal to the air mass through the exhaust ports. And the funny thing was, it was kind of amazing because I don't really understand why, but it always gave convergation or converged. Is that English?
Maybe.
It finds a solution.
Do you mean confirmation?
No, it means it comes to a stable solution.
Convergence.
Okay, convergence. Yeah, converge. Yeah, that's the right word then. Yeah.
Convergence.
Yeah. It always converged, and that was I have quite some experience with trying to numerically find solutions for problems, and they don't always like that. But this was it always converged, so I trusted that it gave about right. I give a few examples of results of this kind of calculation. At that time, we were really interested to see what kind of difference we needed between transfer timing and exhaust timing. Everyone can understand that when the exhaust opens, you need a certain amount of time to empty the cylinder so the pressure is low enough that the crankcase pressure can start filling the cylinder. This is more tricky than you would think. I come to that later, but the original idea was that it makes sense that the pressure in the cylinder is at least equal or lower than the pressure in the crankcase when you open your transfer ports. That means that the direction of the gas is into the cylinder and not back into the crankcase. So we did some runs on that, and that's the left graph. It's been converted originally to the amount of air that you get in the engine, and for an engine is the amount of oxygen you have. That's about power, because normally you use all the oxygen. So the more oxygen you can get through it, the more power you can make. In human sports, it's the same. A good sportsman has a high oxygen consumption or use. So, but that's recalculated to timing, to time for 10 laps in a team racing. Because that's what everyone understands. So what you see here is we changed one of the parameters, the venturi diameter. The other one is the time per 10 laps. That's the vertical one, and the parameter, the color of the line has to do with timings. The blue one is 115 degrees of transfer and 140 degrees of exhaust. That's a very normal one. Then we went a bit extreme, shortened the transfer port and the exhaust timing. You see that you gain a little bit of speed when you make the transfer port smaller. I must say that's one thing I did not mention. Every calculation model is as good as the algorithms you put in, or as good as the model you make. In this model, it's simply so that when you get more air into the cylinder, more fresh air into the cylinder, you get more power. There is no, in this case, no interaction between exhaust gas and fresh gas. So it was kind of amazing that we could lower the transfer ports and get more power. In this case, we get less time for 10 laps. You can see also that if you make the difference between transfer and exhaust, 125 transfer and 140 exhaust, when you make that smaller, you see that the time per 10 seconds goes up, so you lose power. And that's very well understandable, because in that case, the cylinder has not emptied enough before the transfer opens. So there's too much pressure in the cylinder. So you push back the hot gas into the crankcase. And when you put back hot gas in the crankcase, you get a higher crankcase temperature, so less density. And also, of course, there's instead of oxygen, there's coming exhaust gas into your crankcase. So these two things make that you get less fresh air. As I said before, this comes from the amount of oxygen, fresh oxygen you get into the cylinder. That's the power. And then you see that you lose power when you have a too high transfer opening. It's better to have that's the gray one. That's with a little difference. When you open up from 115 to 180, that's an extreme difference in exhaust and transfer timing. Then you see you gain power, but you lose from the more normal timings. And this has just to do that when you open up your exhaust to 180 degrees, you lose just a part of the work that the piston does in the cylinder. You throw out the exhaust gas when there's still a lot of energy in it. So you cannot infinitely go up with the exhaust port. This is not a speed engine. In speed, it's all different. Although the effect is there, but you get a lot back when you have a big exhaust and a good pipe. One of the other things you can get out of this calculation is the amount of air you pump through the engine. And you can also see that here that the amount of air really gets less when you have the too small difference between transfer and exhaust. So at that time, there were quite a few engines that had this very small difference between in timings. I think the Nelson had something like that. And I remember that in those days, people could get improvement on Nelson performance by opening up the exhaust a little bit, but not too much like we did. We did too much, and well, there were all other kind of effects, which I will discuss later. Do you want to stop for questions, Barry?
Yes, I think so, Rob.
Any questions that should be, because I'm talking.
Can you see those questions in the bottom of the screen, Rob? Maybe better if you just pick those questions.
Yeah. Well, the first question I will answer, but on the email. Sorry, Neil. Why are piston? Wait a minute. Why are two FCAs full skirt unlike your? Paul, the answer to that question comes pretty soon, and one of the next one, it's an indirect answer, but it's a kind of answer. Well, Taffy makes a statement that it was easier to have a half-A engine run than an F2C engine run. I can tell you, Taffy, if you make a 5cc diesel team race engine, it's completely impossible. So you are right. Well, this is about F3D. Sorry, Paul. Maybe I come back, but maybe more in private then. What's the benefits of AAC versus ABC? There are, I would say, well, AAC is lighter. That's one thing. In team race, weight is important. And I don't like for team race the heat sink, the higher mass, which is kind of slow reacting. That's another thing. And there are you can hardly find brass materials which have the stability of good aluminium alloys at higher temperature. The deformation of brass is much more than aluminium. I mean, the good aluminium alloys, they are more stable in shape. So Paul has another good question, but it's not where we are now. Well, I think the historical change, there's a question about an historical change we made. Well, we made it not alone. I told you the aluminium cylinder, the AAC was presented at the '78 championship right after the final. We went to the integral one. I think that has an advantage. But I think the two together, but mainly the aluminium compared to steel, because the heat conductivity of aluminium is so much better that you can simply make more power. The next big gain, I don't know. I wish I knew. I will show you at the end of my talk what we are working on. Promising I'm coming to that, Paul. Promising modification. We tried Nickel liner coating, and it was horrible, horrible. I think there is some, it had to do. The Nickel did not work because it seemed that the friction between the piston and the Nickel was too high. We always got kind of melting places, small melting pieces. Asking about reed valve, we never tried reed valve. We tried disc valve, but you can find disc valve in the FMV story of 78. The disc valve doesn't give a direct flow of fuel and fresh air on the big end pin. And when it was 2 weeks before the World Championship in 78 that we had to change from the disc, which was a disc on small ball races. It was a beautiful piece. I still have it, but it would make the pins blue. The silencer, I come back later, maybe. One of the other I go on, Barry, if you don't mind. I go in the story.
Yep. Pick back up.
I hope the people had the questions in front of them, because I did not repeat the questions. Maybe I should have done that. Anyway.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, it's much easier to be in a small room and see the asking questions of everyone, I mean, the eyes open. One of the things that came from this model was how the energy that's coming from the fuel and the air is distributed over the engine and over where it's going to. You can calculate from the fuel we have 7 cc of some mixture with kerosene and ether. What should 2250 joule? Watts for the kind of consumption we have is about what's going into the engine, which is a bit less than 3 horsepower of heat. Well, we get on the axis, that's what this model gives. 27, that's what we know we have, about 500 watt in those days, which is about 0.65 horsepower. That's what we got from the old FMV in somewhere in 78, which is 28%, and it goes on. You see, of course, there's a lot of loss in our exhaust gas. That's what makes a 2-stroke engine not so easy to get efficient, or any IC engine to get. I made one red. That's the piston friction. This is one I will talk about later, because that's the most difficult one of them all. What we could calculate quite well was the energy that goes from the heat by radiation and convection from the hot gas in the cylinder to the head and the cylinder and to the piston. The 140 watts. Well, in this specific case, this is not an absolute thing. This is just to see about what the ratios are between all these heat losses. So about 8%, small 8% goes into real heat to the cylinder. That's what we have to cool by fins. And then there's going quite some energy to the big end and small end. Is big end, I think 90 something is big end and 20 is small end. So it's about 100 watt on the big end. So there's a reason to cool it. Well, that goes heat into the piston. And then we have bearings on the shaft that should be quite low. It's not so easy to find data on that, because our load, I come to the load after this, is very, of course, it's not very constant. And then we have in a two-stroke, the crankcase is a pump. It pumps air through the engine, so that needs some power. It's a 35-watt pump. And then we need some energy to vaporize the fuel. That's not so much. And then there's some rest, which has to do with a backplate or some rubbing things. That's not so absolute, but you should not. These are not holy figures. This is just a kind of impression we got from our calculation, this simple calculation model. I mean, yeah, I should have given different colors. The calculation model did nothing on the mechanical friction of the shaft. It gives the crankcase pump, and not the vaporization is in it, but not big and small end are calculated by other means. I made the piston friction. I made it red because we have no piston rings, and we just have a piston that has a certain size, and we have a kind of tapered cylinder where the piston is pushed in. When you do calculation at the temperatures we get, you see that we get in the order of 0.05 millimeter expansion of the whole system when it runs. In a pylon racing engine, it's a 0.1 millimeter that the cylinder gets bigger when it's running at full power, which gives a kind of perspective to the accuracy we make a piston fit, which we do on 2 micron, which is a factor of 50 down from that. So the whole system expands 50 times more than the kind of accuracy we are trying to get in our piston fit. How does that work? Why does it work? Well, it is quite simple. The piston friction is, of course, there because the piston needs, well, when you don't cool the piston on the cylinder, it's expanding because it's getting hotter. As soon as it's getting hotter, it will touch the cylinder wall and lose heat there. As soon as it loses heat there, it gets smaller again. So it finds a kind of balance at a certain temperature. That means that, for instance, pistons that have a looser fit, they will have to expand more before they touch the cylinder wall and can get away the heat. So that's a basic reason that a smaller piston has to run faster to touch the cylinder. The problem is when it cannot get that far, then it's overheating. So a too small piston will never work properly, and a too tight piston will find the balance at a lower total temperature. Now this is a very complex thing. I write 100 watts here, and I think in a properly running engine it must be much less, because otherwise we would have much more problems on the touch and on the place where the piston touches the cylinder. It's a very interesting subject anyway, but of course it's very funny. Many people feel their engines when at room temperature, how the fit is, and they have a very good feel what is right and what is wrong. But if the whole system is at running condition, then it all changes. And still people are able, that's a funny thing with people, they are able to know from experience which kind of fit works well for them. And that's another interesting part of the story. But the physical part is very difficult to understand. It's just almost, for me, still not, I not really get there. It's of course this is the piston friction, but there's also something like the heat that goes from the piston into the cylinder, which is an extra heat load to the cylinder. This piston friction is not in this calculation model because I have no interaction in the model between the piston and the cylinder. I just saw questions about this. This is going to the load on all the bearings. I mean, mainly the big end and small end bearing and the bearings of the shaft. What you see here is this is a calculation model that we use later when we're working on the pylon engine. It's coming from Frits Overmars, who is one of our Dutch guy who worked a lot in two-stroke motor racing. He was part of Yamati. He was as a kind of theoretical man, and he made these kind of programs. And here what you see here is the angle of the crankshaft in the center. It's top dead center, and at the sides it's bottom dead center. So here it's low, and here it's high. The yellow line is the pressure or the force that the gas gives on the piston. So this is when it goes up, of course, there's a compression, gets hot, then then it goes down, and then you see this bulb that has to do with the energy that's giving the combustion to the piston. So that's why the pressure is higher on this side. So more or less the work that's given by the combustion is about this area under here. So that's the force that's on the piston. Goes like this. Of course, you can play with your ignition moment. When you go earlier in your ignition, this will be higher, and maybe it's not as effective when too much of the area comes before. You want, of course, only at or after dead center. You want to have your heat being released. There are also mass forces, and that's the yellow line here. Oh, sorry, I have to look. This is this yellow line for this case. This is the mass forces at a low RPM for team race engine, and this is the same for a speed engine. This is at 23,000 RPM, I think, and this is at 40,000 RPM. It's the same piston, and it has the same kind of combustion. When you add the two, you get the real forces on the crankshaft and on the conrod. In a team race engine, you see that the mass forces are relatively small compared to the compression forces, the pressure from the pressure in the cylinder. So that means that the bearing system of a F2C engine is loaded almost with the full compression force pressure. When you are at 40,000 RPM, you see that these mass forces, they help to get this away, because at the same moment that that you get full pressure on your piston, at the same time the piston has to move downwards, so it needs to be accelerated, and part of the force goes into the acceleration of the shaft. And you see that you get, when the piston goes up, you see a pulling force, because of when the piston is thrown up, and it has to be slowed down to speed 0 at top dead center. Then then it's pulling the shaft. So this is pull on the conrod and pull on the shaft. And here you see at ignition that you hardly get any extra pressure on your system. So this means that a speed engine at 40,000, the whole ball race system is not loaded as much as in a team race engine. Interesting thing is that when you look, when the power is really released to the engine, effectively it's when the piston is going up, not when it's going down. That's in a speed engine. In a team race engine, it's released when it's going down, because the mass forces are not so high. I hope anyone understands this, but you have a film and you can. It's more extreme in pylon racing engine. I wanted not to talk about pylon racing engine tonight because it would be too much. But in a pylon racing engine at 33,000, with the weight, with the mass of piston and everything that's normal, you can see that during going, this is the period that the piston is going down after ignition or during ignition, that you see that the force on the crankshaft and the conrod is almost 0. And that's quite amazing, because the pressure that's in the combustion chamber is just enough to accelerate the piston and the conrod. It has not more. So the power is only given when the piston goes up into the combustion chamber in this phase, and when it's pulling the shaft up. And that's giving a different, maybe for many people, a different idea of the balancing and the forces inside the engine. And we designed this, the pylon engine in such a way with the masses of the piston and the conrod that we would get something like this. So that we are close. This looks like, well, we've seen it on the test bench, but it's a feel that it's a kind of happy situation for the engine. When during ignition you don't have too much force on the crankshaft, but maybe it's just an idea. But that's the way, anyway, I have designed after that. In the team race engine, it's not possible. There is too little mass forces. You could make a heavier piston and get the pressure on the whole bearing system down, which is maybe not according to your intuition. But if you would make a heavier piston and conrod, then you would have less forces on the shaft and the conrod, but you get more external vibration, which is something you don't want. But then you get foam in your tank and all kind of other problems. We don't want too much vibration in the models. Shall I go through some questions?
Yes, Rob.
Yeah.
I think if you could start from Neil Lickford's question at 7:35, he asked about team race pistons, ports, etc. Maybe this time read the questions out. It may make it referencing a bit easier.
Paul had about the promising modification. Yeah, I come to that one.
Yeah.
The silencer, I will do something on the end. I see the time is running, so.
What about Andy Ellison's one? We'll come to at the end. What about Richard Palmer? Did you make the pistons tapered and oval like a race piston?
Yes. We always do. It's already in the FMV article from '78. We made this. We don't make them oval. No, we don't make them oval. Maybe we should do, but well, I'm only an amateur. Everyone should know, and I have not a machine that can make oval pistons. And in team race, I'm not so sure, because you want engine when the cylinder is round. That's a bit of a problem. So when you have an oval, and when the cylinder gets round on the ground and you have still an oval piston, then it may not start. So we never did this anyway.
I think Taffy
about the ABC. I never tried ABC because, as you said, I find the material too unstable. It loses its shape. One really hot run and it seems to be gone. So okay,
Rob, there was one question that kind of slid off, but I've got it here. It was about bearings, and I wonder if you could answer this one. It was from Frank Waddle. I recently started racing tethered cars, 2.5 cc. The tethered car guys have a very interesting. They are very loose. The fit in the crankcase is very loose as well.
I cannot hear you properly.
Oh, okay.
Can you repeat, Herr Barry? Your voice.
Yeah, I haven't got a very good connection. We'll come back to it, Rob. I'll copy it out and we'll come back to it. So if you go on with the presentation, Rob, please.
Yeah, I have to go on. We had the opportunity to do wind tunnel work or have it done by a student, and we wanted, of course, when we had this calculation model, we want to do some verification or calibration, let's say, of the calculation model, and see if it was anything right on it. We measured temperatures, and we measured also propeller traction, but I will not talk about this tonight because it's about propellers more than. But we wanted to know what the whole cooling of the engine did, and how the temperature distribution over the engine was. That was one of the main things. So it's not the best picture you could think of, but I still put it in. This is a fuselage was made specially for this wind tunnel experiment. What is very special for a wind tunnel is that we have a real engine, a two-stroke engine in the wind tunnel. And maybe some of you know how wind tunnels work, but this wind tunnel, it was quite a big one. It was on a aviation school in Haarlem at that time. But after about 30 seconds of running of the engine, you see nothing anymore because the smoke goes round. I mean, the air goes round. And so we had to do something special and let the air out of the wind tunnel because the oxygen would be out very soon. That's not so easy. And of course, it's not so easy to start the engine, heat it up, and then do a run with the wind tunnel. It was hard work. I think we did 5 evenings of 3 or 4 hours to get 20 proper runs with properly running engine. This is about what is inside the model. Well, it's more or less where the thermocouples are and what we did. So that's just you can see here that we had the possibility to put hot air into the engine or block it off and have more or less the normal setup with warm air in the engine. And then the second year after, we had a similar student. Is Eric Janssen. Many of you know him. He was a F2B pilot, quite good, and he did his thesis on electric. On the same experiment, but then with an electric motor on the prop and electrically heated cylinder head. So we could more accurately see what was really happening on the heat transfer in the cooling system of the engine. He studied a lot on how you should make cooling fins for optimum cooling power or for whatever. Anyway, what was the relationship between the two? How effective our way of cooling in the model was. What was very important and very interesting for us was how oval are our cylinders getting when we run them in the model, because the air comes on the front of the engine. It goes very well through the sides of the engine, but it doesn't really hit the rear of the engine. So what temperature differences would you get? And you know, when I tried to make pistons, I tried to get within 2 microns or something in roundness. And the whole unroundness of the system under normal cooling condition is something like, well, maybe 50 times that. So you get very oval cylinder in running. As I said before, that was the reason we had special piston which would adapt to that. And then, of course, the wall thickness, people that know my engines, that we knows that we use very thick wall cylinder, and that's, of course, done to have a lot of conductivity for heat to go around, so that you get less ovality. And that was what was tested in this study of Eric Janssen. Well, you know, it would go too far to go through both reports. That's maybe 2 days, but so I just go to the conclusions we took from it. We found from the running in the wind tunnel with the real engine that there was always a temperature increase during the run when we had a normal setting, which was something like a 35 lap setting on the prop we used. The engine was pretty normal behaving. And we had something like the right airspeed in the wind tunnel, so I think it was quite right we're doing. And our conclusion was that it would be better to make more power and have 25 lappers instead of 35, which normally was done, and we did, to keep the cylinder temperature in closer limit. We measured in those. We measured the cylinder wall. Well, where is that? I thought it's gone here. I will tell you. The cylinder wall temperature that worked, where the engine was in a kind of normal running situation, was between 160 degrees centigrade and 230. Between those temperatures, there was no difference in how the engine run. It was at same RPM, same consumption, everything, between 160 and 230 degrees centigrade. When you have a lean setting, you always have an increasing temperature of the cylinder wall. We could never get it stable. We had no lead in the fuel, I must say, and maybe that would help, but we always got at a kind of racing setting, we always had a temperature that was rising. And if you have 35 laps, then during those 35 laps, it may not rise more than between 160 and 230. Above 230, the oil gives up. There's no oil that will really give good lubrication above 230 degrees, but that was our finding anyway. So we decided from all that work that we should run 25 laps with a rich setting. Then there are two things happening. First, you have a shorter time for the engine to heat up. And the second thing is that because you can run with more fuel, more rich, the steepness of the rise of the temperature is less. So that was one of our conclusions. The other conclusion I gave already, that 25 degrees between transfer and exhaust is about the minimum you need for our RPM range of that time, 22,000 to 25,000. We were running at those days just under 23,000 in our engines. And we did not find that the exhaust timing itself was very critical. We could move the whole cylinder up and nothing really happened. But the difference between transfer and exhaust was very critical. From the calculation, we found if we have more cooling on the cylinder and the head, we can simply make more power. The ratio between the mechanical power and the heat that going through the head is pretty constant. So for that reason, we should run a higher compression ratio, but we would get a higher bearing load. And, oh, sorry, yeah, we need bearings with a higher load capacity. So the same happened more or less when we opened up the exhaust. We needed to give a higher compression to get a proper burning. When we calculated on the heat generated by the conrod on the big end, it made sense to have needle bearings on the conrod, because the plain bearing, we don't know the lubrication condition, of course. It's very hard to tell. But whatever we found on this, we thought needle bearings would be the way to go. And we have been optimizing the cylinder wall thickness and something with cooling. That was on the work of Eric Janssen, so we changed the shapes of those. And of course we tried, but we never really worked hard on that, was to change the way the cooling duct worked to get better cylinder roundness. This is very specifically for team race engine with integral cylinders. For something like a speed engine, for instance, the speed engine firstly has relatively a lot more internal cooling from the fuel, a lot more fuel, and usually a cylinder that hangs more or less loose in the crankcase, maybe not on top, but there. So there the cylinder gets easier round, but the more air you put on a head, the more unroundness you get anyway. So for this steam race setup, we tried, but we never really worked hard, to be honest, on this cooling duct shape. I don't know why now. So from all this work, we designed a new engine in 1984. I read somewhere people called it the monster. I think it was someone who wrote it in Aeromodeler. It was a long stroke, and it had a very, very strong bottom end. Because all the forces we calculated in the engine, we thought, well, this is all much too weak when you see the peak pressures, the peak forces on the shaft system. Then we need much better much better bearing everywhere. So we made a 15mm shaft. It was a 1528 bearing. You see here, this is a tungsten balancing part piece with 2 bolts. Sometimes, well, 1 broke ever, so not too bad. And a steel conrod made for caged needle rollers. Well, as I just said, the cylinder and head were more or less, they followed our findings from the work before. We also made the small version of the old FMV with the needle bearings and the steel conrod and another type of balance weight. And then after a few years of trying, then we found that this big engine, which was strong enough, it was extremely stable. You could set the compression everywhere, it would run, but it was too slow. So that's, that's what happens. We also found when we did experiments also in this engine and others that when we put more distance between transfer and exhaust, we still tried, we're reducing burning efficiency, and we needed much higher compression and it would never run. More cooling is very hard on the engine, even on the very strong bottom end, even if we got power now and then. And then the needle bearings, we really did the one-to-one comparison. We never really found much better. Yeah, you want to see it because you worked hours and hours to make it, so you want to see it's better. But to be honest, after a few years, you say, well, come on, forget it. In the end, we got these 25 higher exhaust, well, higher exhaust before, not extremely high, but higher exhaust, and a high expansion cylinder. So when you have a higher expanding cylinder, then your piston may get hotter before it touches the cylinder wall. That worked. It was not so easy to start, but well, we were at least at the Euro Championships in '87. We had one going really, really well. The richer setting made the engine much easier to set, much more reliable. We got reliability for this. And we won many competitions simply on reliability, not because it was a faster setup, but it was maybe 3-4 seconds slower than when we put the same engine on a 35 lapper, but it always was there. And the 2-stopper was more critical with laps and everything. So this is about what we did in the 80s. And then we hated, after that, the big bearing. So I went back to really small bearings, to the duplex, which was also not my idea. I think we first saw it in the Chipolas of Gino Foguera. I think they were running the 816 duplex as the main bearing. Well, you see here a few cases we made on several setups with steel front ends. I still like steel front ends, to have bearings sitting in steel instead of expanding aluminum. These are a few examples of engines we made in, I think, 1990 or 1991. This is one of them a bit later. It's called MB in the meantime, not FMV anymore. It was working together with Peter Brendel, Metkemeijer Brendel engine. The right one has also the steel, the duplex, or the 3 bearings, 2 bearings here, 1 bearing here, with all bushes in between to set up the place and the position. But this is a steel bush that goes straight into the crankcase. So the bearings are sitting in a steel bush. This was a quite successful engine. Bert and I had very good results between 92, I think, and 95 with this one. It was also a very stable engine. Maybe you hear that I always talk about stability. That's the only thing we were looking for. One engine that runs for 100 laps and not is not too critical on setting. So if you are on a competition, you have not the time to set it all the time. You still have something working. Then some people that fly pylon and are here, they may recognize the style of these engines because it was in the same time as we were working on pylon engines. Here two things changed. This is an engine with a complete casting of the cylinder. So the ports are here in here. And it has a complete steel crankcase, also with the three bearing setup, duplex here and single here. It was a kind of attempt to improve scavenging. Maybe we were influenced too much by people that just make power and don't have a self-ignition engine like we have, which is a very, well, not so easy to understand phenomenon. What happens in this? This is the same engine, but with an aluminium case and the steel bush, the bush here. Yeah, these are, maybe many of you ask how you make all these engines. And as you said, I'm a true amateur and I make this is a mold for two types of cases, similar cases. I just make them on the hand milling machine and the lathe. These are, of course, made to make waxes, and the waxes are going to the foundry and cast. This was to do with this engine, with the cast cylinder. I wanted to do more bottom end experiments to understand better. Well, this is one with not a duplex bearing on. This is with normal bearings, and these are the molds to make the cylinder. Here you can see something of the shape of the ports. We made very nice ports like they use in motor racing. The port splits on top. You cannot see it here, but it splits on top into two extra ports. Or in the end, it's a 5-port engine. So from that period, there were some conclusion that the duplex bearing work fine. They aren't any better, but they work fine and they're stable and they don't really wear or they don't break. Or, I mean, they don't get worse. They could run for a long, long time. Well, after a lot of work, we found that better displacement scavenging, so just to push the fresh gas in and the old gas out, does not work. And it seems against a principle that in this kind of engine, you need to recycle gas. It's the same idea as the two open exhaust port. When you throw away too much of your old gas and you don't use a little bit of it to come together with your new gas, then you have an engine that won't burn. That will not. You have to give compression and compression, and it will hardly ignite. So these engines were simply not good. So the bottom end experiments were useless because the cast cylinders were not any good. They did not work at all. So anyone who wants to try this, you have to do it better than I did anyway. At the same time, we were making our props smaller and smaller. Our RPMs went up from 22,000 to 23,500. And to be very honest, that gave the main improvement over everything we did in those days. You know, it's a kind of frustrating thing, but just making the smaller props and setting your engine for it, that helped much more than anything we tried on the engine itself. Even when we went back to our 1979, the first AAC engine, when we put on that prop, we were just, 1 second faster for 10 laps. One thing we never did, and we did not use tetraethyl lead, fuel, which stabilizes lots of things we have had problem with. Maybe we could not keep up with the others at that time. They were using it, and maybe their engines were also better, I don't know. But maybe we should have used it. But my brother, he was a chemist. He said, we're not going to use lead, period. So you all know that we stopped team racing somewhere after 2000, more or less. Bert was said, I'm too old. I'm not physically able to fly any good anymore. yeah, he was used to be dominant in the circle, and he wasn't anymore. The others became stronger, so we stopped and we went into pylon a little bit more. Now, our intents out 2010, I started again with Ferenc Orfos. Well, did a lot of we did some new work. One of the things many of you know is we worked on silencer. So I made engine with silencer. Well, was not as good as the open engine, but we were getting close. But this is a development that has stopped now. This is more or less what I've been doing in this time. I'm not casting the crankcases anymore, but I'm now mill them from bar stock, and we can use any good material for crankcases we want. We can use any expansion coefficient. We can go for higher thermal conductivity. I use a lot of RSP materials to make these cases, and at least we get very constant quality. So that's what I'm doing now. This is the latest version of the same idea. For people who fly pylon, this is the pylon engine that will be made in the same way. At the moment, of course, we all know Ukraine is in big trouble. So my prototype cylinders and crankshafts are probably on a delay. And there's another experiment I did. I think I said future here. I still think, and maybe it will be my last trick. Someone asked, will there be a big next step in engines? And I remember the big step in 1966 from Bill Wisniewski, who came up with a tune pipe on his speed engine. And the world championship in 64 was won with 230 kilometers an hour, and he won in Swindeby with 260 kilometers an hour. And the first, well, Theobald was 240, he was still behind him, he used the same kind of setup. But the first open engine was doing 230 and 232, I think. So within 2 months, the whole world was flying tune pipes on speed engine. I've never seen after that an open speed engine. Well, maybe in 5 or 10 cc, I don't know, but not in FAI. So I have been trying last year and the year before, Corona years, I had a little bit of time to make a few engines with not a real rear exhaust, but a 30-degree, well, a little bit side exhaust. Under the current rules, that's allowed. And I even made a test bench. I'm not a test bench man, but I made a test bench to see what it would do for a team race engine. And given the fact that we are on 3mm Venturis now, which reduces the amount of air we can get in, anyone knows that a tune pipe get more air through the engine. That's what a tune pipe does. So a way to get more air through the engine is to make a tune pipe. Now you see here a pipe you can hardly recognize as a tune pipe, but it is. And it works like that. It gives about 1500 RPM more to the engine. And the good thing is, it makes the fuel consumption higher. And at the moment in team race, we have 7cc tanks, and we have all engines that run 40, 42 laps. So we cannot really use the fuel because we have not enough air in the engine. You need air to burn. Everyone, the good settings are 40, 42 laps, 45 laps. This engine, I've not measured it yet, but it uses more fuel. You have to open up the needle to get it running properly. The difficult thing will, of course, be because in team race, acceleration is very important. And I've done tests for that. And I'm quite positive about it. So we'll see. But that's my future. So if you say, are you going to make a big step? And say, I think I have 10% chance that I will make a big step in the next, let's say, 2 or 3 years. So that was it, Barry, I think.
Okay, Rob, yeah.
Too long again, but
we still have a lot of questions. Let's see if we can pick off some of those. I think Richard Palmer's question here, I'll read it out. Did you try to reduce the crankcase volume to increase gas speed? So this is really back to that sort of very old two-stroke tuning.
Yeah.
stuffing the crankcase down. Could you
In an
comment about that?
open in an open engine, like a team race engine, not a tuned pipe engine, but an engine that needs the crankcase as a pump for the air, reduced crankcase volume is a way to get more power for sure. And our calculation model was very clear. Of course, you have a practical problem. You cannot infinitely reduce your crankcase volume, but in the current engines I make and Lerner makes, and I think even Chaika makes, they try to fill the crankcase as much as they can. And this is especially because of the 3mm Venturi. When you have a small Venturi, you need a good pump. You need a stronger pump. So yeah, and we tried. I have a few. I didn't show all my engines, but in the last 5-6 years since I make my crankcases, by milling from bar stock, of course, I can make anything inside. And I have tried to reduce. To be honest, I cannot say it's just a simple step up, because you cannot reduce a crankcase volume. I think the minimum volume for a properly designed crankcase is maybe 5 cc's or 4.8. It's not easy to get it down to 4.5. So the relative reduction of crankcase volume is very hard to get. That's one of the reasons I think it's not that clear. But we still do it, because one of my principles is, if something is in theory better, I do it. And of course, until it's proven to be wrong, because your idea was wrong, but then your theory was wrong. But this theory is right.
Yeah. Of course, the tuned pipe engine is completely different, Rob.
Yes. Yeah, the bigger the better. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there is the pipe is giving the energy to the whole pumping system, and of course it makes the engine not easy to use when you increase your volume. But in theory, the more gas you have in the crankcase, the more you can get into the cylinders. It's that simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're back to another question about the induction system. Why do Teva car engines use Zimmermann valves, but team race and control line speed engines don't? I think, could you talk about, did you ever try a Zimmermann valve on the team race engine? Or are you using more?
No, I never had Zimmermann. I had bell valves in '78 when we had our first FMV. We had the bell valve, beautiful bell valve on bull races, and we had the disc. We never had really a Zimmermann valve, but they for my engines and for our problems with the big end cooling, we need to go central into the crankcase. So we touch the conrod full with fuel, and we touch the pin, the big end pin full with fuel. Yeah. Anyway, that's when I see, when you don't lubricate it properly, how much heat will be generated there, you get an immediate stop. So why these engines can use Zimmermann valves, I don't know. Maybe for them, because you get a lot of air in. And I mean, it's a very accurate way of, although I don't know the friction of it.
I think one of the problems with the Zimmermann valve, we did make some quite nice Zimmermann valves over here, Nathan and I, but you have always got this problem that ideally you want the diameter of the disc to be big.
Yeah. But
then you get this disc brake effect of it panting on the housing. It wasn't well resolved. We actually got. Sorry, Rob.
No, no, just go on.
We've done some tests, and we just got exactly the same power with a Zimmermann as we did with a drum valve. Literally.
Yeah.
You know, no difference.
In team race, there's another factor at the moment. We have 3.0 millimeter Venturis. So, and a Zimmermann valve is meant to give lots of air into the engine. I mean, a very big intake, and we have a small intake. So, in our case, we use, of course, now induction rotor with us, where the fuel comes in centrally and straight on the conrod. And as I said before, if we use any other system, we are in trouble.
I think one of the things, Rob, we got heaps of questions about which are really glow plug, speed and pylon engine questions. That I think it's fair to say that the sort of lubrication needs of the pylon race engine are much less demanding than the team race engine because of the sheer amount of fuel.
Yeah, more fuel, yeah.
Being pumped through, and a lot of oil as well. And I think the same applies to the car engine, the Zimmermann valve engine. Let's see if we can pick out some more questions. And of course, if anyone wants to put their hand up, if you click the raise hand icon down in the bottom of the screen, we can get try and get Rob to answer some questions. So Jerry Newton. So Jerry, if you unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask Rob a question. Okay. Let's just park Jerry for a moment. Let's go to Michael. Michael, again, if you unmute yourself like you've done, go ahead and ask Rob the question. Andy, should they be able to?
Yeah, Michael's can speak now. He's unmuted, so is Frank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Michael,
Hi.
go on and ask your question.
Yeah. How about you, Frank? Frank Waddle? Is it Waddle?
Hi, Rob. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah, this is Frank, is it?
Yep.
Hi, Rob. I would like to go back to my question regarding the ball bearing fit. One big difference I noticed, I just recently started tethered car racing, and one big difference I noticed between what the tethered car people are doing and what everybody else on the world seems to be doing is the fit of the ball bearings. In the tethered car engines, pretty much in all classes, the ball bearings are a extremely loose fit. They have a very, very loose fit on the crankshaft. Sometimes the crankshaft is actually fit in a way that allows it to slide back and forth in the ball bearings. And sometimes they even have a very loose fit in the crankcase. And this seems very contrary to everything I've learned so far about racing engines. So Rob, maybe you can shed some light on this. Why do they do that in tethered cars, and why does no one else do it in pylon or team racing or speed?
Well, I mean, I can only tell from my own experience. I had once an engine, one of my first ever, where I was not so accurate in the lining of the ball races. And that one suddenly went fast when one of the races came loose, which, I mean, this is a bit cynical, but if everything's very accurate and well in line, then of course there's no reason that the ball race should move. And we don't want to have the ball race moving. The reason we went to steel front ends and everything is that we don't want moving ball bearings. And maybe they have the wrong type of ball bearings and they need a kind of movement from it to let it run properly. I cannot really understand. I've seen quite a few tethered car engines and also boat engines. And well, I'm feeling that our pylon engines are further in their development. That's just my feeling. We solved all these bearing problems different. I use, for instance, in the F3D engine, we use for the radius of the ball groove of the main bearing, we use a much bigger radius than are in standard ball bearings, simply to give it the opportunity to move and to bend and everything. And I have a feeling if you have to make everything loose, that could be it could be the reason that things are not by themselves run freely enough. I don't know. I don't really know. but I cannot see a reason, because how loose is loose. That's my problem. I mean, fixed is fixed. I can understand that. And as you know, in my pylon engine, we don't even use an inner ring on the shaft. And also in the modern team race engines, almost none use separate inner ring. They all make the ball groove on the shaft itself, because it's one problem less. It's one potentially moving connection less. So.
Michael, can you hear us,
Hi.
Michael? I think Michael's probably dropped off or can't hear us.
I think
So.
Michael's drifted off, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There was a question.
I see here a
Rob,
question on dyno. Can I answer that one from on the?
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please,
Well,
Rob,
that's a short answer. We have tried dyno, and we have found that it's very difficult, because at every RPM, when you don't have an electronically regulated system, I mean, like a fuel injection system that is regulated by exhaust or whatever, you have to do many runs with very many different needle settings. And that's why we, in the end, stopped with that. And we went back to just having a number of test props and just test, let's say 4 or 5. And if we really want to know what an engine is doing, it's not for team race engines, actually. It's for pylon engine that works quite well. But so I would say it's not worth doing something like this. I would just make 4 or 5 test props from a little bit too small to a little bit too big, and test every engine with that. And then you have a very good indication what your engine's doing. So next one.
Okay, let's see what else we got there. Maybe if you could answer those 2 questions from Eric bottom, Rob.
Eric Krins.
Simple answer.
How do you recognize when an engine is close to failing, overheating? Ooh,
Yeah,
that's not so simple. Well, failing, one of my experiences that the engine is at its absolute fastest just before it breaks in pieces. So overheating in team race, maybe Eric, it's a very Dutch name. Is it the Eric Krins I know? Probably. I know one. But he's doing free flight. I know. Yeah. Well, doesn't matter. Overheating, we can hear very well on team race engines. And in the wind tunnel, we have learned that this overheating, which then the engine goes to sound a bit less clear, it has to do with earlier ignition, of course. It's going to pre-ignite, and then it's going to overheat, and then it's going to pre-ignite more. So we can hear it as a team race pitman or team race people. They recognize this very quickly, even 5 laps before it happens, that it's starting to overheat. And that's exactly in the wind tunnel. When we found this 230 degrees, it was always there. Whatever setting you had, when the cylinder wall was going over 230 degrees, you got overheating, even with a kind of popping engine with a too big prop or so. So the overheating is, for me, it's an oil thing. And we know it when we did a lot of testing with synthetic oils in team racing, which have a very sudden jump from lubrication to vaporization or burning. That that was very sudden. So when the oil stops to work, everything changes. Seen for bearings, I don't really know, because the only really failure in bearings we had a lot of problems with was overheated big ends bearings, but ball bearings for the shafts, I would say, yeah, they can make the engine slow, but I think mainly because the whole system is getting hot. You know, the pump of the crankcase is not working so well when the crankcase is too hot. When you want a cool crankcase, a cold crankcase. So when the bearings are heating up the whole system, then you lose a bit of power. But you cannot simply recognize that. When we did the first F3D engine with the front induction, then we had too little play on the shaft. We had this integral shaft, and we didn't have it right yet. And then it wouldn't go really. It was going, but not so good. And then we opened up I think 8 or 10 microns on the shaft, and it was suddenly the best engine in the world. So you don't recognize it, but by trying things, you can find it out.
Okay, Rob, we got
The other
Carl here.
question
Let's-
was, I never had one of my in the tethered car. There has
Oh,
been
no, that's right. Yeah.
there's been a man who put my cylinder on his crankcase in a boat, and that worked really well. But
Yeah. I think it was a German guy, wasn't it?
yeah, Demel, I think,
Yeah.
Gerrit Demel. Yeah.
Yeah. Carl, have you got a question? Carl says near us.
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. First off, the rod's big end. Is there an advantage of the cage bearing over the loose bearings, rollers like they use in the CMB marine engines?
You're talking about the needle bearing?
Yeah.
The caged and the uncaged.
Yeah.
No, I have no experience. When we did our needle bearings, I can tell you, I bought a spark eroding machine to make to make the cages for the needle bearings, because it's against everything that's inside with me to have a non-caged needle bearing or whatever bearing. So I never tried that, and I didn't tell that maybe, but in the end, I did not like the needle bearings. The first thing was that they didn't help. I could not see a big advantage. But the second thing, I don't want 12 little pieces of hard metal in my crankcase. I just don't want them there. So if you look at my pylon engine, you see it's an engine with very few parts. It has not a lot of parts, and certainly not inside the crankcase. There's one clip to keep the piston pin there, and I hate that part. It's the worst part of the engine.
Yeah, and it's also the most finicky part to work with.
Sorry?
It's also the most finicky, not so easy part to work with, that darn little clip.
Yeah. Well, when it breaks, that's the worst.
Oh yeah, I've had those break, and there goes the piston and cylinder.
Okay, Carl,
Yeah.
that's good. I think Rob answered that question pretty good. Let's bring on Neil Lickford. Neil, can you hear us okay? It's a shame that we can't get Neil on. Must be that delay all the way over.
Back in bed.
Yeah, no, he put his hand up and he's unmuted himself whilst Carl was talking.
Are you there, Neil?
There's a few more questions come on. I think. Okay.
There's one question.
I think one of the things.
That's from Pavel Shubrok about bearing losses. Why you use ceramic balls? Because of bearing losses. The reason we use in the pylon engine ceramic balls, I don't use them in my team race engine. I tried them, but I did not see any advantage. And they were more critical on the groove. They seem to do something to the groove more than steel balls. It has to do with expansion. One of the main problems of bearings is that the balls are expanding when they run. If you have a pylon engine and you see the speed of the balls and how hot they get and how they have to get away their heat, then you rather have maybe a material that has less thermal expansion. So the reason we use ceramic balls is expansion more than that. Although myself, I'm always talking against myself. In the last 2 years, I have increased the play on my shaft on my own pylon engine. I've been running steel balls, and they are okay. So there's no absolute need for ceramic balls in this engine when you increase the play. But the engine feels a bit, well, almost like a plain bearing, but it runs fine.
Yeah, rattly, worn out. Could you talk a little bit about big end clearances, Rob? So much on the team racing engine, but let's say on the pylon engines.
Sorry,
see
I missed
quite
the
some
part.
difference between. Could you just talk a little bit about big end clearances, please, Rob? Particularly on the pylon engine. I know you don't much want to talk about the pylon engine, but there's a hell of a lot of questions come in about that.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, well, the team race engine is where I come from, and I think that all the work we did on team race engine for, let's say, over 20 years has helped me a lot to make good pylon engines. I think that's absolutely true. For this time, you ask about the development in the pylon engine at the moment, or sorry, I missed part of your question. That's sometimes you're not there.
No, we have suffered from very poor connection tonight, but we battled on. No, I was just wanted to know about big end clearances. Is there anything you could say? Have you carried your philosophy across from the team race engine into the pylon race engine, or do you think that there's another way to look at that big end clearance in the pylon race engine? I particularly think that, you know, when you say the engine goes really great and then it goes bang, I actually think there's something going on with the big end clearance. Is at that point the conrod's almost becoming elastic and it just opens up, goes nice and quick, but then breaks. Many times this happens. Big end breaks as the engine goes really fast. I don't think it's load.
I know what you mean. Yeah. Well, I would say that the pylon engine, maybe I should do this again, maybe in half a year or so, about the pylon engine, because everything is very different in pylon engine than it's in team race engine. There are just a few very general things, like we discussed tonight, which are very similar. You can learn, make, let's say, a good bearing system from the team race engine and apply it to pylon, but still things are different. Like the, well, you know, the ratio between size and RPM is very different. The team race engine runs 10,000 RPM less, and all the sizes are even smaller. So for that, it's a much easier engine, but the loads are completely different on the bearing system. So it's very hard. But as I said, from team race engine, I've learned, well, at least a part to understand, and we applied it to, so we were a little bit ahead to build a pylon engine because we had that knowledge. But it's, for me, it's a complete, it's very, very different. It's very different. Although some of the solutions, like the 3 bearing setup, that was the first one we had in the pylon engine too, but that was just my period in building engines, that I wanted to have the duplex main bearing. I don't know. So that's how we started it, and it went pretty well. Also because of the RPM. If you just look in the tables of ball bearings, and then you see the highest RPM that could normally be used, and then you see you're pretty close with the sizes we normally use in the pylon engine. We are pretty close. And I wanted to get away from that. That was why I started with smaller ball bearings.
Rob, one last question there. Can you see it from Barney? I think this is the perennial problem. People want tight engines, but it's all a matter of where it goes when it gets hot, I think. If you have a look at Barney's question, I think we'll make that the last question then.
That's about the tight fit.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, there is, yeah, I don't really know, to be very honest. It can be reasoned, I know from the used engines, that the control of the materials was well, there was not perfect control of the alloys of the cylinder and the piston. I know where they were made, and maybe he had a batch with a very low expansion piston. And I think that could be the reason, or a high expansion cylinder. We have seen some of that, but it's just guessing. I don't know. But what I see in general, and of course I'm not so good in F2D engines. In F3D we have much more experience. That the tight fit gives usually a very nice engine to work with. They're strong on the ground and they work nice, but there comes when they lose their fit, or you make a looser fit, you can sometimes get a kind of high performance, but at the cost of some unreliability. It's not as reliable. Yep. And I know the tight fit of the combat engine, at least you have something that works all the time. But I don't have a reason. As I said, if you do the calculation on piston friction, then you get more friction when you have a tighter fit. You cannot go around that. No. And if you have more friction, you should have less power. So there must be other reasons. And as I also said, the running condition is much different, and you don't know sometimes all the expansions. And so maybe he had one, because all my team race engines with the high expansion cylinder had extreme tight fit. They were so tight that you could hardly start them cold, but once at temperature they were fine. So
I think you mentioned, Rob, about turning the pistons very accurately, sort of less than 2 microns out of round, and obviously we've made pistons recently and we've achieved that kind of tolerance. I think the only thing that you can be sure is that piston is not round when it's running. Neither is the cylinder.
Yeah.
So
even without cooling at the exhaust side, you get enormous expansion every. Yeah, it's right. Yeah.
I mean, my hunch is that the cylinder goes into some kind of egg shape up towards the exhaust port, and I think the piston probably follows it. I think there's something going on like that where they're almost following one another.
Yeah, or they don't care too much.
Or they don't care
to be completely sealed. Although sometimes the pistons look perfectly. I mean, the wear pattern is sometimes perfectly equal everywhere. So that's against it. I just don't know. And there was also one question: if we ever have tried to have not round cylinder fins, there could be a very good reason also for aerodynamics actually to have on the sides of the piston much less cooling fins, and much on the front and a lot on the rear, and try to get cold air on the rear. I think that's always good, and I've seen people that try to work in that way on cooling on their pylon models anyway. And I think, well, it's always hard to tell, but I think they're doing good thing. But I never measured anything on that. We never had a pylon racer in the air with 5 thermocouples around the cylinder, because when we did the measurements on the cylinder wall temperature, we drilled until about 0.3 millimeter from the real cylinder wall. We were really close. And if you go further away, it's already not as good anymore. Then you don't know what you're doing. The 6-cylinder walls, I see John Schoen has hey, how's John? He said 6-cylinder walls, the FM, when we made the 1.5 cc FMV, it has just a 6-cylinder wall because the piston was a lot smaller. That was the only reason at that time. So it was not the right inspiration. It helped as well. That engine was extremely stable and strong, but smaller engines are always simpler than bigger engines. But the very thick cylinder wall maybe helped to make it good. Possible.
Rob, I think we're going to have to wrap up now. The BMFA side, Andy needs to call the meeting to a halt, to an end. It has been a really great session. We had, just a whole bunch of people in there, about nearly 170 people watching for quite a lot of the time. We really need to get you back for let's say a glow plug engine session, F2A, F3D session. Would you like to come back at some stage, Rob?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, the reason I really want to do this, apart from the time it costs, is that for myself, it's good to write down the things we did, in the past. I don't know why I want to do that, but that can be important, and at least to remember what we did. So F3D is the same. It's a completely different story, and we did less of this kind of work I talked about tonight, but we tried a lot, and it's interesting to discuss about that. Yeah.
I think
I can do it maybe after. Maybe after, somewhere in September or October or so.
Yes. Yeah, I think what we'll do is you and I will talk about it through the summer, and we'll arrange something for the let's say the autumn, sometime like that, because I think it could probably be a little bit more informal. A lot of the questions that come up, actually, you'd be able to answer on the fly. So we'll talk about it through. Okay, Rob. Yeah. Oh, Paul's just said, yes, we would love another session on glow motors. Paul Gabot from Canada, really what I said, a glow engine session. Okay, Rob, thank you very much for taking part. It's brave of you, but it's been really great.
Yeah, it has. Excellent.
Yeah, quick update on next week. We were going to have Neil Tidy from Laser Engines, ex-Laser Engines, talking about 4-stroke engine design. Neil's got to go to hospital that day. So what we've got next week is the drone racers. They've brought their session forwards. So that would be drone racing. I think Neil's going to be 12th of April or something like that. And also the control line speed, guys out there, don't forget, we've got that control line speed training day for the newcomers at Buckminster on the 26th of March. So I think with that, bye-bye, Rob. Great.
Thank you, Barry, for organizing this. And anyone who has questions, most have my email address. You have more questions out of which were not there tonight. I can, of course, answer by email. I like to do that. And it was, good to do.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rob.
Thanks, Rob. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Cheers.